The Colonial Zone is a small town nestled in the capital city of Santo Domingo, on the mesmerizing island in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic. A place that magnificently blends the old and the new in an ineffable way. Follow us along the 11 blocks of historical and amusing streets within this walled city. If you want to relax, sit in one of our many parks and watch people while enjoying the soft Caribbean breeze and listening to the story of the figures that walk these streets. We will now stroll through these mesmerizing paths and reminisce the art and the poetry that lived and continue to live in the neighborhood. Let's go back in time to when Salome Ureña, Fernando Enriquez and Carvajal, and their 4 children, Francisco, Pedro, Max, and Camila, consumed the streets of the Colonial Zone with their unbelievable eloquence. From 1860 to 1880, Salome Ureña went to live with her mother, her sister Ramona, Teresa de León de la Concha, and Ana Díaz de León in the house number 56 of the street 19 de Marzo. Her domestic education was received by her mother and her aunt Ana, the second mother in the home. Her father taught her the classic works of Spanish and French writers that helped the young Salome to develop her own career. Living all her life in the Colonial Zone, the most illustrious Dominican poet, Salome Ureña, made a poem called Ruinas, where she illustrates the architecture and ruins of the Colonial Zone. Their children would later become highly respected figures of the mid and late 20th century as writers, philosophers, poets, and critics of the arts. Around 1881, Salome, with the help of her husband, opened the first center of higher education for young women in the Dominican Republic, called Instituto de Señoritas. Walking through the Calle del Conde, stop by La Cafetera, number 253, the heart of the Colonial Zone. It is a small creamy place that shows a green statuette that identifies the year of the foundation of the site, 1930. And the select public who visited years ago. They say that the building where the coffee is embedded was part of a colonial palace, and that at its height lived a brother-in-law of the very Napoleon Bonaparte himself. A Spanish man known as Benito Paliza, because of his great interest in culture, decided to open the colonial cafeteria in 1930, better known as La Cafetera, with the purpose, among other objectives, of promoting artistic and literary gatherings at the place located on La Calle del Conde. This information can be found in a plaque located at the entrance of the cafe. Since Don Benito came from Spain, he yearned to build a place or a meeting point for intellectuals, motivated by the European custom of cafes, bars, and bistros, places to consume a good coffee or tea, to have a snack or even a beer while interchanging ideas. Don Pedro Mir recited there the verses of his well-known poem, There is a Country in the World, and the heated discussions that were generated with the reactions of other poets and critics.
Fluvial y material, y sin embargo, sencillamente tórrido y pateado como un adolescente en las caderas, sencillamente triste y oprimido, sinceramente agreste y despoblado.
The nostalgia does not allow us to continue without the memory of the notable José Sestero, Un Quijote Insular, or the figure of Pedro René Contín Aybar, poet and art critic, who sat at the end of the cafeteria elegantly dressed, carrying a colorful fan given to him by Lola Flores. Possessed by an elegance that he impeccably exhibited, he would walk down La Calle del Conde to go to the missing ariete or to complete his routine at La Cafetera.
Del destino de que apareciera en escena en esta cafetería que tiene ya 90 años que existe.
Many artists, such as Estero, chronicler of the Colonial Zone, have painted him in different facets and times. More artists that would sit in the wondrous place to have a drink, a coffee, or discuss among colleagues were Guillo Pérez, Virgilio Díaz, Paul Giudicelli, Radames Mejia, among many others. La Cafetera was considered the hotspot and meeting point for multiple literary movements and groups in the Dominican Republic, including the members of the surprise poetry and later the Ochentistas, members of the 80s generation. The stories of La Cafetera are unique and very picturesque. Returning today, we can highlight that this abundance of characters gave it the title of a special place that still remains. To this day, the main artist is the painter José Sestero, a faithful visitor of the place who calls La Cafetera the only true emblematic among the old cafes of the colonial zone. It represents a cultural treasure that still lives and that revolves around the aroma of coffee and Dominican culture. When you go inside, you will find people of every age sipping their coffees with a book on the table, discussing politics, history, philosophy, or the arts. Most probably, you will bump into the notorious painter José Ramón Medina. José Ramón Medina is about 60 years old and stands casually holding a book. Overly dressed for a hot and sticky Caribbean day in a royal blue shirt with long dark pants, he speaks to me in rapid Dominican. We sit down with him to discuss the story of La Cafetera and enrich our knowledge on the colonial zone.
Manuel del Cabral, que muy a menudo visitaba la zona colonial, incluso la Fundación Manuel del Cabral está aquí en la ciudad colonial, como resultado de eso. Podría decir que casi diario venía don Manuel del Cabral, pero a menudo venía don Pedro Mil también. Venían otros grandes poetas, Carlos Gómez Burli, Carlos Lebrón Sabiñón, déjame ver cuáles, otros grandes intelectuales como Andrés L. Mateo, Pedro Peix, Tony Raful, Joaquín Balaguer, un poeta que a mí no me gusta, ni le gusta a la mayor parte del dominicano, porque era una poesía, vamos a decir, decimonónica, del siglo XIX, pero escribió un libro que se llamó La ciudad romántica, acerca de la ciudad colonial. Eso quiere decir que la ciudad ha influido grandemente en la poesía dominicana y una gran cantidad de poesías se han escrito, parte de las experiencias, las vivencias de los poetas en la ciudad colonial. Yo no soy poeta, yo no soy pintor, pero tuve la suerte de codearme con muchos de ellos.
After talking to José Ramón Medina, we were directed by him to one of the many active poets that live in the colonial zone today, Glayen Parles, a tall guy with a sweet face and an eccentric afro. As mentioned by resident painter Medina, one of the most influential poets who resided in the colonial zone was Franklin Mieses Burgos, born and raised in Santo Domingo. He was the author of a brief, intense poetic production. Mieses Burgos was one of the initiators of the infamous local literary movement La Poesía Sorprendida, or surprise poetry. It was inspired by the acclaimed surrealism and by its opposition to Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship. An interesting aspect about his poetry is the complexity and musicality of his texts, emphasizing in the avant-garde contemporary style. Some of his most renowned poetry books are Clima de Eternidad, 12 sonetos y una canción a la rosa, and 6 cantos para una sola muerte. Other poets part of this movement were Freddy Gatón Arce and Mariano Lebrón Sabiñón. Mariano Lebrón Sabiñón, born and raised in Santo Domingo, also lived in the colonial zone. Even though he graduated from medicine, this was not his only passion. Lebrón was an extremely informed and educated intellectual, having the opportunity of traveling and learning from the world. He cultivated the sonnet until he took it to its most finished form. From a young age, he was a great connoisseur of the Spanish and English classics. Lebrón was an intellectual who always encouraged the new Dominican generations to value the importance of the quality of writing. From his own experience and style, he sympathized with the new expressive aspects that emerged in his country. In intellectual and literary circles, he was called the last surprise, being the youngest poet part of the movement Poesía Sorprendida. His poetry created a breakthrough from the classical aspects of literature in the Dominican Republic, inspired by places such as the colonial zone. Medina makes reference to another prominent poet of the 20th century, Manuel del Cabral, born in Santiago de los Caballeros in 1907. Manuel del Cabral did not live in the colonial zone, but made regular visits to devote his days to exploring its fascinating streets that so deeply inspired his works. Manuel del Cabral was able to travel around the world and make contact with many other Hispanic poets. His poetry touches topics such as politics, love, social status, culture, and even metaphysical themes. One of the most important themes of his poetry is the black or mulatto customs in the Dominican Republic and the surrounding countries. Cabral's most outstanding work includes Black Tropic, 1942, Compadre Mon, 1943, The Secret Guests, 1950, The Island Offended, 1965, and Sexo No Solitario, 1970. Pedro Mir is the next on the list of influential poets who frequently visited and was deeply influenced by the colonial zone. Born in San Pedro de Macorís, he was recognized for his profound poetic voice and is considered one of the great pillars of Hispanic American poetry with a social commitment theme in favor of oppressed groups of people. Son of a Cuban and a Puerto Rican, he lived in an area dedicated to the cultivation of sugarcane. His poetry is affected by this peculiar lifestyle, experiencing a mixture of races and cultures. One of the most influential poems he wrote was during his exile in Cuba, called There is a Country in the World, with the subtitle Great Poem on several occasions. A beautiful verse dedicated to Santo Domingo, highlighting the lack of identity and freedom of this country due to its political and socio-economic colonization by foreign powers. His poetry mainly highlights how the Dominican Republic must strengthen its patriotism and its culture, obviating the influences of outside countries. Other important poems of his involve If Someone Wants to Know My Country, Amen of Butterflies, and Concept of Hope for the Left Land. Pedro Mir was a controversial intellectual for the Dominican Republic, not only challenging the traditional values of literature, but also giving Dominican society a voice, unique and detached from any influence. As mentioned by Pearls, the lights and aura of the colonial zone has inspired his poetry. Walking down La Calle del Conde, an overwhelming and thrilling feeling is inevitable for its visitors who watch and analyze all the movement in their surroundings. Stepping out of La Cafetera into La Calle del Conde, you might spot Camilo, sitting down in the benches with a book in hand and his guitar by his side. After a while of reading, Camilo takes out his guitar and gets lost with his surroundings while gently stroking the strings. Later in the evening, after enjoying the amazing melody played by Camilo, we are able to speak to him. He starts to tell us about his history in the colonial zone. Born and raised in the streets of this area, Camilo is inspired every day by his surroundings. He tells us the story of how he started writing poetry when he was 12 years old, after being taught at school about multiple Dominican poets. A few years later, he acquires a guitar and learns how to play. He decided to combine his poems with a melody, creating songs. These songs advocate for his cause, preventing and protecting the poor children from the colonial zone into becoming part of gangs and getting involved in unlawful behavior. Every Saturday and Sunday, Camilo sits here with the kids that gather around him and teaches them everything he knows. Sadly, Camilo recently got diagnosed with cancer and is battling for his life. Souls like his influenced the artistic and humanitarian atmosphere of the colonial zone.
Vamos a cambiar una caja limpiabota por una guitarra. Vamos a cambiar un niño que trabaja por uno que estudia. Vamos a cambiar una mano que pide por una que da. Vamos a cambiar.
At 8 p.m. at night, dancing to the festive music outside any colmado in La Calle de Hostos and Calle del Conde, you can find Micheli. She calls herself La Pajarita, or the little bird. Her physical appearance is that of a man, but she insists it is because she has no makeup on. She was thrown out of her hometown Bani when she professed her chosen identity as a female. She had heard of the colonial zone, a place where people had artistic freedom. She arrived at the colonial zone and met an old guy, curious about her appearance. After a conversation, she learns he is a poet and asks him to elaborate, interested in his background. Later, Michele decides to indulge herself in poetry and listens to what the old man teaches her. She mentions that Colmados and the people of La Zona Colonial are the source of inspiration for her dances, her songs, and her poems. Michele twirls in the mirror, bending and twisting the graceful form she was given, expressing her pain and joy in the flick of a fingertip or the arc of a foot, doing the same in her poetry. We all lead different lives, and yet we are all part of each other's destinies. This is what I learn every time one wanders around the colonial zone, whether one looks up, down, left, right, turn an old corner or a new one. There are all kinds of people to meet and stories to hear, all of them which have affected the culture and history of the Dominican Republic.